Sherif 1961 Robbers Cave experiment is a key study that you need to know for the social approach. You need to be able to describe the study and you need to be able to evaluate the study. Now, the aims of Sherif's study were to look at the effects of group competition on prejudice. Don't forget that Sherif came up with the idea of realistic conflict theory, and he wanted to test that in this experiment. He also wanted to investigate ways of reducing prejudice by introducing the idea of common goals. Sherif used a sample of 22 11 to 12-year-old boys from middle-class families in Oklahoma, USA. They were all well-adjusted, bright, sensible young men, and none of them had met before the study. It was an opportunity sample of 200 from school and then 22 that were selected by the researcher, and the parents were paid $25 not to go and see the boys for 2 weeks. The boys were not introduced to each other. They were divided into equally matched groups, education and athletic ability, from information from parents and teachers. Now, there were 3 stages that we will look at in a second in detail, but in stage 1 the boys were separated into the 2 matched groups and they were kept apart. Toward the end of the first week, the researchers arranged that the boys would begin to become aware of each other. In stage 2, a series of competitions were organised by the groups in which valued prizes and a team trophy could be won. In stage 3, the researchers deliberately set up a few emergencies that could only be sorted by communication and teamwork from both of the teams together. This is an example of a superordinate goal, where everybody had to work together in order to achieve a common goal, and this was Sherif trying to reduce the prejudice at the end of the study. If we look a little bit more in detail, stage 1 was over the first 5 to 6 days. Sherif and his associates observed the formation of the group structure, so the boys were housed in large bunkhouses and they were able to choose their own buddies. After a few days, they separated the kids into 2 groups, being careful to break up friendships that had already formed. The boys were given a range of activities, from campouts to hikes, which was encouraging the in-group formation. In each group, the tasks were divided, and each group developed its own jargon, their own jokes, secrets, and methods of performing tasks. Each group selected a group name and a symbol which they put on their t-shirts, and the names that they chose were the Eagles and the Rattlers. Camp staff were actually researchers who were observing the groups' verbally and non-verbal communication between the groups. Sociometric data was gathered on how the boys rated each other in terms of popularity, initiative, etc. In stage 2, which was the next 4 to 6 days, the researchers introduced conflict through games between the 2 groups. Each individual had to contribute to win groups, and they orchestrated situations that the boys would find frustrating in order to cause the conflict between the 2 groups. The tournament started in good spirits, but soon the boys were calling each other terrible names. The boys refused contact with the opposing group, and they actually ignored any buddies that they'd made during stage 1. When asked to give ratings to the other boys in the camp, they gave negative ratings to the out group and positive ratings to the in group, or the group that they saw themselves as being part of. It was soon after this that the name calling, scuffles, raids became commonplace. The researchers realised that they'd confirmed their hypothesis surprisingly easy, so they then went on to the 3rd aim, which was to see whether working for a common goal would promote harmony and reduce the prejudice between the 2 groups. This was tested in stage 3, which was the final 6 to 7 days of the camp, which focused on conflict resolution, where the researchers established superordinate goals, which were common goals which required everybody to work together in order for them to be achieved. So they established a series of urgent natural situations. So, for example, the water supply broke one day, and that water supply supplied both camps. They had a camp over, so the boys had to work together for food and sleeping gear. The camp truck broke down one day and needed to be fixed, and all of these could only be resolved by working together. So the 2 camps, the Rattlers and the Eagles, had to work together. By the end of the camp, the boys were actively seeking opportunities to mingle, to entertain, to treat each other nicely, and the boys had far less negative ratings of the outgroup. If we look at the results in a summary then, by week 1 the boys had got their own group identity. They identified themselves as being part of the Rattlers or the Eagles. By week 2 they had their in-group favouritism and the negative out-group bias, which was caused by the competition. But by week 3, just having contact between the groups wasn't enough to reduce the hostility, but the superordinate goals was. At the end of the study, the researchers reassessed the friendship choices, and they found a significant increase in the number of boys whose friendships were now outside the group compared to the choices that were made in stage 2. The researchers realised that they'd confirmed their hypothesis surprisingly easy, so they then went on to the 3rd aim, which was to see whether working for a common goal would promote harmony and reduce the prejudice between the 2 groups. When we're evaluating, it's important to remember that you use grave and that you P every point. You point, explain and elaborate or use evidence. Now this study is great because it's got high ecological validity because it's a natural environment for the boys, which was a summer camp, unlike a lab experiment where the behaviour would have been manipulated and the boys' behaviour might not have been natural. It had high levels of control and careful planning at each stage. The staff were the participant observers, so they were observing the boys' verbal and non-verbal behaviour at all time, and they were only intervening when there was a risk to the boys' safety. So this control ensured that staff didn't direct the behaviour of the boys. However, later interviews with the boys after the study had finished showed that the boys saw the audio equipment in the dining hall, they noticed that staff were taking notes on behaviour, so this therefore questions the validity if the boys did actually know that they were being studied. The study is great because it's got real life implications and application. It shows how quickly prejudice can arise when there are competitions between two groups. But it can't be generalised because the study only used white middle class boys from America, so it can't be generalised to females, other social classes, other ages or other cultures. It does lack validity in the sense that the researchers may not have been independent as originally reported. It's said that many encouraged hostility and conflict between the groups, and they didn't always intervene when the physical contact occurred, which they should have done. Now this may be argued that it fueled the hostility, which actually created the prejudice itself and therefore intervened with the cause and effect relationship between the IV and the DV. It could be argued that the study actually supports social identity theory and not realistic conflict theory, because at the end of stage 1, the prejudice had arisen anyway without any competition being introduced. Just knowing that there was another group on the camp that they weren't part of created a prejudice between the two groups. So this suggests that prejudice only needs to occur when without competition but with the presence of another group, which actually supports social identity theory. Ethically, there were some issues with the study as well. So participants' parents gave consent, but they were told the study was about leadership. They were not given informed consent, and that was not gained from the boys themselves. The researchers deliberately induced prejudice, which puts the boys in a very hostile situation where they may have come to harm. There were reports of fighting occurring between the two groups, and therefore the boys were not fully protected from harm. Now, if we're going for a top-level answer here, we need to be able to use alternative research to back up our points. So, Tyman and Spencer in 1983 found that it's not natural condition for strangers to meet and compete against one another. By testing scout groups who were familiar with one another, they found that hostility didn't emerge between the groups and the competition didn't lead to hostility. These findings represent a more realistic outcome and therefore has greater generalisability than Robbers Cave. Now this is an example of June 2012, now obviously this is on the old specification, but you can see an example of a study where you're asked to identify the study that you know, describe it for 5 marks, and the mark scheme shown there, so you can see how we can get a 1 mark answer into 2 marks, so by elaborating on what it is that we're saying. If you look at the top of the screen as well, it also shows that you can only get maximum of 2 marks for aims, procedure, results and conclusions. Now this stands still in the new spec, that is still the same within the new specification. Again, in June 2012, the second part of that question was to evaluate the study, taking that whole question up to a total of 9 marks. The researchers It's likely that you might get a scenario question on prejudice and you have to apply realistic conflict theory and use Sherif's Robbers Cave experiment as supporting evidence to consider how realistic conflict theory might arise. It's also important that you are able to talk about how realistic conflict theory and Robbers Cave study shows how prejudice can be reduced by the introduction of superordinate goals. However, later interviews with the boys after the study had finished showed that the boys saw the audio equipment in the dining hall, they noticed that staff were taking notes on behaviour, so this therefore questions the validity if the boys did actually know that they were being studied. If we look at the mark scheme, we can see how prejudice is referred to. If you look 4th bullet point down, realistic conflict theory may suggest there's competition between the groups which leads to the atrocities. Another one that we did actually answer in class from January 2013, which probably applies to realistic conflict theory a little bit better, is where tension has arisen within a college among a school trip. So it's important to look at that and think about how we could apply this in a scenario question. Mark scheme on the board again here. Now, there are other studies to support in-group, out-group discrimination. Now, Levine in 2002 found that if a Confederate fell over in front of Man United fans wearing a Man United shirt, then they helped. But if a Man United Confederate fell over in front of a Liverpool fan, they didn't help. There are different theories of prejudice which can be used to evaluate realistic conflict theory and Sherif's robber's cave as well, as there are other explanations. So if we look at Adorno says that strict parents and an authoritarian personality can lead to prejudice. And again, some practice exam questions if you want to check: outline Sherif's view on the causes of prejudice, evaluate Sherif's study on prejudice.